I'm using simple materials and techniques to make a micro Christmas room box that's filled with handmade details. I previously made a miniature room box using cardboard, but since this is a much smaller scale, I'm using a double layer of cereal box. The floor is a jumbo popsicle stick and the two side walls are slightly angled for a forced perspective. I'm adding a fireplace to the wall, but there will be a Christmas tree surrounded by presents in the corner, so I'm slightly offsetting the fireplace hole to make room for the Christmas tree. I'll be using the world's smallest bricks on the bottom of the fireplace, but wallpapering the top. Years ago, I printed out this wrapping paper in 1/12 scale from a free printable website. I'm using this really neutral holly print for the upper part of the wall because I want all the decorations to shine, but you could also use cutouts from magazines for your miniature wallpaper. I previously used adhesive-backed cork to make some realistic bricks. This is a great technique and you can make the bricks in multiple different sizes. I will never be using this Barbie scale sized brick, so I'm cutting it into tiny little strips to make extremely minuscule bricks. My adhesive-backed cork was a neutral cork color, but I painted it with some acrylic paints to give it this brick color. I'm always talking about how impatient I am, so I definitely tried to come up with a faster way to do this, but this ended up being the best method. I'm dropping some teeny tiny bricks in place and then worrying about getting them into a line after the fact. The wet glue helps me slide them around. I'm not sure what this pokey tool is because I got it secondhand at Earth and Tree Miniatures for $1. I offset the bricks in a typical brick pattern, leaving a really small space between each of the bricks for a grout line. For the little arch opening, I surrounded it with a few of the bricks to frame it. To prevent the spackle from completely changing the color of the bricks, I'm coating them with matte Mod Podge before filling in all of the gaps with some watered down spackle. I mixed up a little batch of mortar in my cleanest paint tray and started filling all of the lines. Laying the bricks one at a time was a tedious way of doing this, but it actually only took about 15 minutes and was completely worth the end result. I'll be adding a lot of details to these walls, so to make it easier, I made a paper shell rather than working directly on the cereal box walls. I found some pretty green patterns inside of my catalogs, but since I'll be adding a green armchair and a Christmas tree, I'm going with this more neutral gold color accented with some gold string to look like a chair rail. I think most people really despise adding trim to their dollhouses, but at this scale it's pretty simple. I'm adding base trim and crown molding to my miniature using some mat board. Mat board is a thick layered paper product you find in picture frames. To make the trim look more dimensional, I used a wider piece with a thinner piece layered on top. Layering paper like this works at a larger scale as well to make some miniature trim. I'm using a shaved matchstick for a not as chunky mantle. Making small miniatures can be challenging, but look how quickly we were able to make an entire room box at this size. I recently spent 4 days finally organizing the thousands of items I have in my miniature studio. They've never been organized properly. I forgot I even had this little extra bit left over from a 1/44 scale miniature kit. This used to be a window frame, but now it'll be a mirror frame. You could use aluminum foil for the mirror, but I'm using this aluminum tape. To add extra shine, you could use diamond glazed Dimensional Magic from Mod Podge, which is what I'm using, or triple thick. I'm just adding some type of shiny adhesive that I could drop the mirror frame into. The brown wasn't doing it for me, so I'm covering this in gold rub and buff to add a little bit of luster to the mirror. I also want to add a wreath, so I'm using some of this lycopodium moss. I made a 1/12 scale Christmas tree using this stuff, which looks like miniature pine. I'm making the world's teeniest wreath by wrapping this little bit of lycopodium moss around the very end of a skinny paintbrush and tacking it together with some hot glue. The little tiny needles splayed out and kind of looked like a crazy saw, so I'm coming in to trim all of that off, plus trimming some of the giant hot glue glob. I just really love when wreaths have bows, so I'm tying a bow using some thread. I'm making the loops really big and then pulling the tails to make the loops tiny, so it's a lot easier to do than if I tried to just start with extremely tiny loops. For the space to the right of the mirror, I'm making a trio of Christmas trees using 3 different sized toothpicks. I'm pretty stoked about this set of 24 alcohol markers I recently thrifted from Goodwill by the pound for about $1. I started out with 2 green trees and 1 Sharpie red tree, but the smaller green tree wasn't quite the vibe, so I ended up covering that with gold rub and buff. Multiple times during this project, I dropped something tiny I had just created and had to remake it, and this little gold tree was one of those things. The trees weren't standing out quite enough, and I wasn't sure if they actually read as Christmas trees, so I'm adding some of this gold nail art decor to the top of each tree. I was racking my brain trying to come up with a way I could make a gingerbread Christmas village for the top of the mantle. I did that at 1/12 scale using some Monopoly pieces I painted, but that was not going to happen at this tiny size. Instead, I cut a rubber earring back in half to get this bell shape. I'm giving it that aged brass look using a black base coat and some gold rub and buff. I'm capping off my pretty bell with this tinsel-like thread. The stuff is essentially made out of plastic. It's kind of hard to see on the gold bell, so I'm adding some tiny red caviar beads that are meant for decorating your fingernails to add some contrast. I fished out some of the beads that are rolling around in the bottom of my plastic tray and added 3 to look like holly berries. The mantle is looking so cute, but to make this festive as hell, I'm adding some garland. I'm adding some dried moss in really small pieces, making 2 swags. I'm adding some caviar bead ornaments one at a time because I want to avoid the non-Christmas colors. My color scheme is silver, gold, red, and green. For a bit of contrast and pop, I'm also adding some white caviar beads. I'm spacing out the colors pretty evenly without making them perfectly symmetrical. The miniature mantle is decorated, so now I'm addressing the 2 blank spaces on either side of it. This is real miniature metal filigree that's meant for decorating your fingernails. There are a few different shapes, but I'm fishing out this little oval shape because it looks like a picture frame. I've seen people who can paint on a grain of rice, but that is just not me, so I'm attaching my filigree to some leftover wrapping paper bits. I cut out the size I would need and added it to a thicker piece of paper to make it easier to handle. Some diamond glaze holds the frame on. I wanted the painting to look like it was hanging from a bow, but it didn't quite look right, so I'm gluing it directly under the bow. I'm spacing both of the frames the same distance from the center fireplace so I can leave room in the corner for my Christmas tree. I'm using this mystery dried plant to make my Christmas tree. It's a little bit floppy jalopy, so I added it to an acrylic roller with some white glue to stiffen it up. It's too skinny as it is and looks like a pencil tree, so I'm adding some extra fluff to beef it up. In November of 2020, I bought 13 boxes of Dollhouse Miniatures and supplies from a former collector who had passed away. The boxes included a bunch of furniture, miniature kits, raw materials for making miniatures, and magazine cutouts from the 1970s. This mystery greenery was included in that lot. For the past 5 years, I've been using many of those materials on my channel. It feels really good to be using the pieces the women didn't get a chance to use. After coating my miniature tree in watered down white glue and allowing it to dry, it's ready to be decorated. I'm starting by hot gluing some of that gold tinsel thread on the back of the tree and wrapping it around. This is one of the materials I got from the miniature collection. Just like you would do on a full-size tree, I'm starting with larger ornaments and working my way to smaller ones. I haven't used these big red clear beads in any other part of the room yet, but they look great on the tree and mimic the tiny beads I used on the mantle. I got nail art decor envy by watching Little Gretchen's workshop use these tiny studs in her creations, so I'm using some of the larger silver ones to add some ornaments to the tree. I don't have any beads in this bigger size, so this is a great use of these. The tree is fully decorated, but I don't have a topper, so I'm adding an extra piece so I can prop up a bow filigree piece at the top. I would have liked to use a tiny star, but I don't have one, and bows have been trending for years, so this will work. This is one of my favorite parts of the entire project. I used a bunch of weird materials, not including this big paper straw, to make some miniature gifts for under the Christmas tree. I have a paper Q-tip, a cake pop stick, some mat board, and some matchsticks I glued side by side. The mat board and the matchsticks are about the same width, but they're different thicknesses. Having variety in the sizes of your gifts makes your miniatures look a lot more realistic and interesting. I did a little bit of sanding of the super glue on my matchsticks before adding some scraps of my wallpaper and my magazine cutouts. I didn't want to wait for the glue to dry, so I cut the strips of paper the size of the finished gift. This way I can cut beside the paper instead of through it, since wet paper often tears. These gifts will be stacked up against each other, so I don't have to worry about all of the sides being finished and looking tidy. For some of the gifts, I left some overhanging paper so I could fold it in a realistic manner, and this was pretty satisfying at such a tiny scale. For an extra chunky gift, I stacked some of this mat board on the matchstick. I thought these gifts would end up being too small, but I also used a single matchstick wrapped in thin strips of paper to make gifts. These are probably 1.5 millimeters high, but the room is so small they end up looking so cute and in scale. I'm spacing the paper apart so I can cut out each of the individual gifts without cutting through the paper. I filmed some of the prep at home, but cut out these gifts and wrapped them in paper during a craft meetup at a local library. I'm adding ribbon and bows, starting with some of this really thin tape I got from Temu that's meant for decorating your fingernails. This gift will be propped in a corner and you won't see the bottom side, so I'm only wrapping one corner. I used a really thin piece of red tape, so I'm adding a red bow using a cluster of caviar beads at the very top of the gift. If this gift was a bit bigger, this might have worked, but I think the embroidery floss is a little too chunky, so I'm using sewing thread for any more of the thread wrapped gifts. To make it easier to add the ribbon, I coated each of the pieces with gloss Mod Podge. I'm mostly using beads to make my bows, but this one's getting a thread bow. I'm stacking the gift I just wrapped on this piece so it only has half a bow since you won't be able to see it anyway, and I wanted to save myself the effort. This is a Q-tip and magazine cutout gift with some beads on top. This super simple gift is just a Sharpie colored marker topped with beads. To avoid using paper, I covered most of the cut ends of the gifts with marker and glued some of the gifts together for easier handling. I fully intended to make a miniature chair from scratch, but I was looking across the room at this little kit I previously made and decided to steal this wingback chair. I swapped the stolen chair with this little unfinished chair for now. I would have planned my room box around the size of this chair had I known I would be stealing it, but as it is, it's a little bit too short, so I'm removing the bead feet and replacing it with some coffee stir stick layers. I felt bad for the stolen feet, so I added them to the Christmas tree so they wouldn't go to waste. The chair is taller, which is fantastic, but the underside looks very questionable, so I'm wrapping a skirt around it. I would love to use this velvet ribbon, but it's way too thick, so I'm using some of this satin ribbon to make the skirt. The left side and back side of the chair won't be visible, so I'm simply gluing the ribbon down flat. Most of the miniatures I make really only have one good side. My plan was to overlap the ribbon and tack it in place as I went with some glue, but at this small size it would have been way too difficult, so instead I'm doing something desperate and pulling out a sewing needle. Sewing is probably my least favorite hobby of all time, so I don't generally sew, and I have been chastised by commenters on my channel for using hot glue and tacky glue, but in this case a needle and thread is a hero because a simple running stitch allows me to create a very tight ruffle pretty quickly. I'm making a simple ottoman to place at the foot of the chair using the end of a wooden paintbrush. This is so small you could use a bead or even roll up some paper to get to the proper size. I've been watching Tiny View for so long, I'm starting to realize you really can make anything out of paper, so don't ever let your materials stop you. I used one of the deer heads from this magazine cutout to wrap one of my largest Christmas gifts, and now I'm using the argyle end to cover just the top of my ottoman. I was hoping to use some of my leftover ruffle to wrap the bottom of the ottoman, but it would have been too bulky and I didn't have enough, so I'm just using some plain ribbon. When I recently reorganized my studio, I got my large metal filigree pieces all together in this labeled plastic thrifted container, and it is so damn satisfying. I'm using this piece to make a miniature plate for on top of the ottoman. This is obviously a little bit too big, so I'm coming in with some cutters and cutting just one of the small circle pieces out. I got these miniature dikes from Goodwill by the pound, and I really love them because they cut through metal so easily. To fill the hole and fake the look of a cookie, I added a couple of layers of wood glue and painted it beige. For more contrast between the cookie and the gold plate, I repainted the plate with my chrome marker. I'm finishing the cookie with some chocolate chips, or these could be raisins if you're one of those types. I have some scrap Q-tip left over from when I made my miniature gifts. I'm cutting through the paper layers by rolling my blade along it and then cutting it lengthwise. Cutting through the paper layers like this allows me to unwind some of them and make a much skinnier paper stick. This is a clever little trick I learned from Dollhouse Minis. I'm making a tiny glass of milk for Santa, but you could also use this technique to make cigarettes like Dollhouse Minis did. I thought of yanking off the old yellow accent pillow, but instead I'll stack another pillow in front of it using the scrap of ribbon. Making teeny pillows is my favorite because it couldn't be easier. I'm adding a really thin line of hot glue on one end and using tweezers to fold this up a couple of times. Then all I need to do is cut it to size and forget to film myself gluing it to the chair. To introduce more pattern and color, I'm making a miniature rug to place under the ottoman. I'm using paper bag to cut a backing for the rug because the scrap ribbon I'm using unwinds easily. I glued the paper in place and now I'm slightly cutting outside of the lines of the paper backing so I can create fringe. I'm gently pulling the loose threads around the perimeter to create the fringe. It won't unravel beyond the glued on paper backing. For a deeper, richer tone, I stained the popsicle stick flooring using some antique Waverly wax. To introduce another dark wood tone, I'm using a scrap spindle from a vintage reminiscence armchair. This already has a great shape, but it's not as pointy as I need and it's a little too long, so I'm using my emery board to trim it up. Since I have a miniature fireplace, I'm creating a very tiny bellows using this little scrap piece of wood with the end painted gold. I made a bellows at a 1/12 scale using some popsicle stick and some fake leather, but I don't need to do all of that at this minuscule size. I finished it with a little tinsel bow on top and glued it to the right of the fireplace. You can join my Patreon either as a free member or for $3 a month. Thank you for watching.